The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I welcome the opportunity to stand and talk about this legislation. To me, Mr. Speaker, it's deja vu all over again. As a union representative and a former healthcare worker, this is Bill 148 all over again. This is the same old for this Liberal government. They say one thing and they mean another. Bill 148 took away bargaining for healthcare workers. It imposed a collective agreement. It imposed a financial settlement on public sector workers, on 75,000 public sector workers. And I hope each and every one of you are watching now to see that it's continuing with the Crown prosecutors, because the way this government says they bargain is a disgrace, because it is not bargaining. It is dictating. And I've stood in this chamber countless times and said, this government does not bargain, they dictate. They tell you the way it's going to be, and if you disagree, oh, well, sorry, we're a majority government. But you know, I just have to pull up what I was just looking for while my colleague was speaking, because it's funny how things change when you're in an election year. And back in the day, in 2013, an open letter to union members from this Liberal caucus. The Liberal caucus would like to clarify misinformation. And the email indicates that the Nova Scotia Liberal caucus is against the right to strike, and this is absolutely false. It goes on to say that this Liberal caucus believes in the collective bargaining process, the right to strike, and protecting workers' rights, both union and non-union. Mr. Speaker, this couldn't be farther from the truth. This could not be farther from the truth. And then in 2013, the Premier says, and I quote, "He will continue to respect your hard-earned rights and collective agreements." Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know one collective agreement in this province that this government has respected, because they haven't. They have dictated and they have imposed contracts and wage patterns that, again, they bargain in bad faith. This government bargains in bad faith. And when I say this government, I mean the employer, because at the end of the day, they are the employer. And if I was at a bargaining table, I would take this to the Labour Board and say, this employer is bargaining in bad faith, Mr. Speaker, because that's what's happening. And I would also like to quote, because I find this kind of funny, when Bill 148 was being passed, and I will quote the Minister of Health, "We want to be fair and consistent in our approach. Don't want two classes of employees. I want to be clear, government respects and appreciates the hard work performed by all employees who deliver public services to Nova Scotians, and government is committed to both meaningful collective bargaining and to preserving the public services that Nova Scotia needs." Mr. Speaker, this could not be farther from the truth. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing that represents good collective bargaining in any of those statements that the Liberal government has put out. Government, Mr. Speaker, is framing this change as an enhancement for the bargaining rights for the Crown attorneys, but it is anything but. It eliminates access to arbitration for Crown attorneys, and it does so against their wishes. The framework agreement that they were bargaining under is dismantled. Mr. Speaker, as my colleague spoke of, when you are in bargaining, you do not, under no circumstances, reveal any of the terms of the proposed collective agreement or agreement in this situation. Because then, and as this government has alluded to several times, they can't give us the RFPs for P3s because that would taint the waters. They can't give us a bid on this because that would taint the waters. But yet, here we are in bargaining, and they come out and say, before the Crown attorneys knew, you're looking for 17%, but we're looking to give you 7%. Mr. Speaker, I don't think we have to be rocket scientists in this House to understand that that is a breach of confidentiality, and this government should be ashamed of themselves. Any time that this government goes into collective bargaining with unionized employees or Crown attorneys, Justice, any of these groups that have a contract, Mr. Speaker, it is breached. We see a pattern here. We see that In this case, with taking away arbitration, this government is taking away the right of a third party to intervene and to resolve conflict. Mr. Speaker, what faith does this government have in the Labour Board and or its arbitrators that are used every day in Nova Scotia to make decisions that are right for the employees? Not to predetermine an outcome, but that are the right end results for employees, because at the end of the day, that's what we should be talking about. We shouldn't be talking about, you know, we're just going to give you this, we're going to give it to everybody, and it doesn't matter that we're bargaining, because you're not actually bargaining. Mr. Speaker, this government is trying to pull a fast one. Double speak.
Order, please. I'd like to remind the honourable member that's unparliamentary. I'll get you to retract that. And the honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, how do you tell the truth when you can't use certain words? How do you, and I'm serious question, how do you tell the truth in this chamber when you're not allowed to call a spade a spade? Serious question. No, you don't tell the truth.
Order,
sorry.
Please. The honourable member will retract that statement as well, inferring that other members of this chamber are not telling the truth. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Well, I would appreciate, Mr. Speaker, if I could get an answer to that.
I would suggest that the rule book that every member has here is available to you to peruse at your leisure. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The imposition of...
Order, please. I'd ask the honourable member to retract the two inferences that the members opposite were not telling the truth. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
What is the word that I can use then? Because I've read that book several times and it doesn't give me synonyms to say what needs to be said in this House.
Is the honourable member going to retract the statements?
Am I going to get an answer to my question so I can continue? I'm just asking.
Is the honourable member going to retract the
I will
statement?
gladly retract if I could get another word.
Is the honourable member, it's the last time I'm going to ask, is the honourable member going to retract the statement?
Yes. Yep, I'll retract it.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Sadly, though, I'm sure the teachers, nurses, doctors, home care workers, justices, judges and justice of the peace that have been disrespected by this government wish that I wouldn't retract certain things. But I will, because this is important and this I need to stay and talk about. This legislation, Mr. Speaker, is wrapped up in a fancy package, but guess what? Nova Scotians aren't buying it anymore. Nova Scotians realize that whatever you call it, this government is doing what they want, Mr. Speaker, and not what's in the best interest of Nova Scotians. It's a pretty bold bet to make that yet another group of workers in this province are being stripped of their collective bargaining rights without some recourse for the courts. Because, Mr. Speaker, that's what the Labour Board is there for. That's why we have arbitrators. That's why we have conciliation, Mr. Speaker, so we can be grown up and be at a table and work together. There's that word again, work together. Wow, let's try it. It might actually work. Mr. Speaker, and I've said this 100 times, how many times do you go into a bargaining room and I always called it a wish book. You go in with the Christmas wish book because you want, as the union or as the worker, you want all the bells and whistles, knowing full well that if you get a Sobeys flyer at the end of the day, that you've got a good contract or you've got a good agreement. But you can't get to that when you bargain in bad faith. You can't get that Sobeys flyer, Mr. Speaker, when you have a predetermined outcome going into bargaining, because that's what this government does. Mr. Speaker, the day is going to come when this goes to be heard at a higher level, and Nova Scotians are going to be on the hook, because this is unconstitutional. It is our right to free and fair collective bargaining. It is our right to sit across the table from our employer and come to an agreement. And Mr. Speaker, the day, and I hope it's soon, the day that this is found to be unconstitutional will cost taxpayers a lot more money than it would cost to give these Crown attorneys a half-decent settlement. Mr. Speaker, Bill 148 is a disrespect to workers. This government's inability to come to a table and reach a collective agreement is disgraceful. Something I didn't realize, and I'm thankful that all of my colleagues talked about this, that if you don't get these cases heard within a time frame, they fall off. I had no idea. How can we risk this? Imagine the cost of these cases falling off the docket and people going free or whatever the case may be. Imagine the cost, the human cost. How, Mr. Speaker, can this government put a price tag on human cost? Because I would think, as my colleague from Dartmouth South said, we need more prosecutors. We need more Crown attorneys. And she also spoke of the fact of the doctors. Well, I've said it twice this week. We've got beds empty in Glace Bay. We've got beds empty in North Sydney, but we've got no doctors to admit the patients. But yet we can't fit another flea in the regional hospital in Sydney because the hallways are full of admitted patients, and the homes are full of patients who couldn't get their surgeries because they were cancelled. So is that what we're doing? Are we picking another fight with Crown prosecutors like we did with the doctors, with Doctors Nova Scotia? Because right now, Mr. Speaker, we've got beds, we've got hospitals, we've got people looking to go in them, but we've got no doctors to take them. And Mr. Speaker, that's what's going to happen with the Crown prosecutors. And I fear, I almost think I fear for the safety of some Nova Scotians. Because as others have said, where does this leave us as a province if we're letting people go free? Because this government refuses to pay and what they're worth and bargain in good faith. The government has tried to strong-arm doctors, and I believe, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what's happening with Crown attorneys. But sadly, you know, at the end of the day, the government's not losing. It's the residents of Nova Scotia. It's the patients of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, that are losing out at the end. It's the 13 surgeries that were cancelled yesterday at the regional hospital because there was no doctor to admit them. It's the fact that, well, New Waterford Hospital is now closed, but Glace Bay has adopted the hours of New Waterford. So now Glace Bay is only open Tuesday to Friday from 7 to 4. So it's the residents, Mr. Speaker, that are suffering. It's the residents that are sick. It's the residents of Nova Scotia that aren't getting the treatment and the care that they deserve, just like the people going through the court system. And they, Mr. Speaker, will be the ones that suffer. Mr. Speaker, when you talk about what happens at a bargaining table, and I said this earlier, but I would think that this employer, the government, should know that it's confidential. So we have a predisposed position now set out for these Crown attorneys. How do we move forward from here without this government intervening and imposing another wage package? Because that's what's happening. Mr. Speaker, this government has no idea how to bargain, has no idea how to bargain in good faith, that's for sure. This government has no respect for teachers, for nurses, for all healthcare workers, for all public sector workers. And I wonder, is this just, like my colleague said, there aren't too many more public sector workers that they can try to dismantle, that they can try to force an agreement upon. But I look forward to the outcry from all public sector workers after this debacle. Because let me tell you, I've already started to get some of that social media and texts come my way. And Mr. Speaker, I guess this is just a way for this government to say, okay, anybody coming behind you, so teachers, prepare. We're imposing another wage settlement. Healthcare workers that are coming behind you, prepare, because we're imposing another wage settlement. So, Mr. Speaker, I have to ask the question, why even bother? Why does this government pretend to respect unions? Why does this government pretend to respect the collective bargaining, what should be free and fair collective bargaining rights that union members and groups are a part of? Why does this government think, well, this government thinks they're beyond reproach. But let me tell you, the day of reckoning will be coming, and I can't wait, because you know what? At the end of the day, people have the right to choose, and people, Mr. Speaker, have the right to form a union. They have a right to free and fair collective bargaining, and this will all, as my grandmother would say, will come out in the wash. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward. I hope that the Crown attorneys are allowed to have however much time they want at law amendments, because when it was the other public sector workers, this government dictated the hours of law amendments. And Mr. Speaker, I would say that that is a violation of our constitutional right as well. Because if 10,000 people want to come and present before law amendments, it's their law. It's Nova Scotians' law, Mr. Speaker, not ours. So if 10,000 people want to come and speak, 10,000 people should be allowed. But this government, during Bill 148, no, we're cutting it off. We're in charge, we're cutting it off. We're only allowing this many people to speak. So it's like a bad kid. When you don't get your own way, you just take your bat and ball and go home. You know, and again, as adults, as legislators, as negotiators, why can't we work together? Why? Nobody will tell me any different that when you go to a bargaining table that you can't come away with a deal, with an agreement that everybody can be settled with. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, we've been this close to going on strike. And in the 23rd hour, we've gotten a deal. It may not be with all of the bells and whistles, but it's something that everybody, both sides, can live with. And Mr. Speaker, I bet if we sat down and all pretended to work together, we could get there now. But sadly, that's not the will of this government. And I hope everybody connected with public sector workers, with unions, with Crown attorneys who are outraged with this heavy-handed approach yet again comes and speaks to law amendments. And if they're not permitted, then I think that they should, it is tomorrow, then they should say their piece. And I won't say what I really want to say. But I think it's time that everybody pays attention and starts to stand up for our rights and freedoms, because if we continue to allow this dictatorship to continue.
Order, please. To remind the honourable member that the word dictatorship is an unparliamentary term in this chamber, and I'll ask you to retract that. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
I'm sorry? What is it? Authoritarian? Okay. This government is authoritarian, then. And you know what? Like, seriously, I'd love a list of these words that you're not allowed to say, because how do you... Is dictatorship? Okay, thank you. Anyway, I think I've made my point. I'm sorry? Anyway, I think at the end of the day, the residents of Nova Scotia know exactly what's going on. They're paying attention, and soon they'll have their voice.